Hello, and thank you for joining us today at FIT Authors Talks. FIT Authors Talks is part of the Love Your Libraries event series and is an initiative of the library that brings authors from our community to speak about their work. From photography to fashion illustration, fiction writing to art, these talks encompass a multitude of projects and themes and celebrate creativity. Today, our FIT author is Meira Goldberg, a flamenco performer and scholar who has taught classes on ballet, modern dance, and urban dance as an adjunct associate professor at FIT since 2005. Her monograph, Sonidos Negros, on the Blackness of Flamenco, was awarded the 2020 Barnard Hewitt Award, as well as honorable mention for the Sally Baines Publication Prize, both from the American Society for Theater Research. The book poses the questions, how is the politics of Blackness figured in the flamenco dancing body? And what does flamenco dance tell us about construction of race in the Atlantic world? Thank you, Meira, for joining us today, and welcome.
Hi everyone. I'm so glad to see you all. I am going to share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, share. All right, great. So I want to thank you, Jen, and all the staff at the library. As I write in the acknowledgements of Sonidos, I'm always grateful for the support and the consideration of Bill Mooney, who is the chair of Film, Media, and Performing Arts, where I teach, and to all of my FIT colleagues. But I'm most especially grateful to the Interlibrary Loan Crew, which is headed by Peggy Murphy. Peggy is as in love with books as I am, as all of you guys are, Paul. And without them, I literally could not have written this book, and nor could I have be working on the next project that I'm working on today. I'm going to be speaking to you today about the major themes in Sonidos, the development of what we think of as race and how it is expressed in the dancing body. My expertise is, of course, in flamenco dance, as you can tell from the title, so that's my focus. But I think it is felicitous that my expertise is in flamenco because it turns out that flamenco, which comes from Spain, is a fascinating case study that can help us see important aspects of our shared American culture in a new light. All of us know that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but I would venture a guess that many of us don't appreciate Spain's outsized impact on European colonization and enslavement in the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade began on the Iberian Peninsula. The Portuguese began their raids along the Atlantic coast of Africa in the 1450s, and Spain was not only the first and biggest European colonial empire, but also a European hub where people were bought and sold until the mid-16th century, when captives began to be held in the islands off the west coast of Africa, such as Saint Tomé, before being taken through the Middle Passage directly across the Atlantic. Another crucial aspect of Spain's involvement with the development of slavery and racism that many people aren't aware of is that the ideology of racism itself, which justified slavery and which still underlies much of the racialized aspects of our world today, developed on the Iberian Peninsula out of religious and not ethnic or geographical distinctions. Before the Iberian Peninsula was Spain and Portugal, it was for 800 years part of the Afro-Islamic world, what we might think of usefully as the Black Mediterranean. And the Christian battle to conquer Iberia led to the emergence of an us or them ideology, which saw Muslims, Jews, and animists alike as other. Jews and Muslims were expelled from Spain in 1492, the same year that Columbus landed on Hispaniola, present-day Dominican Republic and Haiti. But the ideology of distinguishing between us and them was used as a justification for slavery. It was said that to enslave African people was good for them, because even if they were worked to death, forcing them to convert to Christianity would save their eternal souls. It's important to note two things here. Not only did enslaved people never stop resisting, and I always recommend the Dominican Studies Institute, which is part of the CUNY system, which has an incredible bunch of online resources. And in particular, they have an award-nominated film about the first slave revolt in the Americas, which was in 1521 in Dominican Republic. But even among the church crown hierarchy, there was debate and consternation about slavery. As Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas wrote in his short account of the destruction of the Indies of 1542, it came to pass that the Indians should be commanded on the penalty of a bloody war, death, and perpetual bondage to embrace the Christian faith and submit to the obedience of the Spanish king. That is, it came to be that Native Americans were forced by war, violence, and enslavement to accept Christianity and obedience to the Spanish king. And Casas continues, as if the Son of God, who suffered death for the redemption of all mankind, had enacted a law when he pronounced these words, "Go and teach all nations." Casas continues, such inhumanity and cruelty merits nothing but hell itself. By centering my study on flamenco dance, I can also tell some other very important stories. One is about the triumph and transcendence of the African cultures of enslaved people and their descendants. And the other is about the alliance and shared cultural legacies between Africans and African Americans, Native peoples, Roma or so-called Gypsies, and the cultures of Jewish and Muslim Iberia. One thing I was trying to accomplish with Sonidos was to puncture some of the mythologies that underlie the racism which afflicts us even today. But the other thing I'm after with this book is to make these contributions to our culture visible and celebrate them. So off we go. The singer in this clip from Carlos Sauda's 1995 film Flamenco is Francisca Méndez Garrido, La Vaquera de Jerez. The people accompanying her are all her family and neighbors, all Andalusian Roma, Gitanos, or so-called Gypsies. They are all from Jerez de la Frontera, an agricultural community known for sherry, near the Atlantic port city of Cádiz. The artists in this clip are descended from a small number of flamenco families. Poet Federico García Lorca once said that 10 or 12 Roma families living between Sevilla and Cádiz are custodians of the truth of the flamenco cantejondo, or deep song. These families are linked by long-standing social and professional networks along the slave routes of the millennial capitals of Andalusia, Cádiz, Sevilla, Córdoba, and Granada, and the many towns in between, especially along the basin of the Guadalquivir River, which connects many of these cities. Like West African griots, flamenco singers assemble their songs out of an inherited body of knowledge and oral tradition. Some flamenco verses can be traced to the light operas of the 19th century, such as Mariano Soriano Fuertes' El Tío Canillitas, Uncle Canillitas, of 1849. This was the moment when flamenco was first recorded as a genre of performance. 1849 was a year of increasing strife in the United States. Frederick Douglass would give his famous speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," just 3 years later. But black-faced minstrels touring Europe in the 1840s established performance tropes that soon became ubiquitous and trendy representations of the ascendant Americas. U.S. blackface minstrelsy, like the institution of slavery itself, was a peculiar reflection of Romanticism's deeply perverse fascination with the human victims of colonial enterprise. But 19th century Spain, in free fall from the pinnacle of white hegemony, was itself seen, as in Washington Irving's Tales of the Alhambra of 1832, as the voluptuous Moorish, read African, object of colonial predation. Spanish guerrilla fighters had captured the European imagination, much like the Ukrainians today, with their fierce resistance to Napoleon's invasion of 1808 to 1814. But Napoleon's invasion had devastating effects on the Spanish Empire. Taking advantage of the turmoil, much of Latin America progressed with successful revolutions for independence between the years of 1809 and 1814. By 1898, Spain would lose its last remaining Caribbean and Pacific possessions, the islands of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Cuba, in the Spanish-American War. By the 19th century, Spain's great empire, upon which the sun never set, was rotting like a tree into the forest floor. This was exactly the moment and the historical context in which flamenco was born, and therefore we cannot extricate Spain's ambivalent responses to U.S. blackface minstrelsy from our accounts of flamenco's formation. 19th century Spain's dreams of sovereignty and autonomy were paradoxically achieved by performing and eventually becoming, in the eyes of Europe, flamenco. Flamenco means Flemish, but ironically inverts this term. The Spanish Netherlands were held by the crown from 1581 to 1714, and they were a lucrative and yet troublesome and rebellious part of the empire. Over the course of the 18th and 19th century, Spain, the once feared conqueror and preeminent colonial power, became flamenco, a derisive comment on the patent absurdity of its claim to Europeanness. The Spain of El Cid, champion in the war against the Muslims, and of Hernán Cortés, who conquered the Aztecs, was reduced to performing itself for tourists. Soriano Fuertes' 1849 El Tío Canillitas is a romantic comedy of mistaken identity set in the Spanish South, Andalusia. It features an English tourist in Gitano drag, but it makes fun not of the English, but of the English tourist's vision of Spain as Gitano other. It is thus a deeply ironic self-portrait, which references more than anything else Spain's long and excruciating decline. If Spain's Muslim and Jewish past had become racialized, the Moor became black. Spain itself, by the 19th century, was seen as black in the eyes of Europe. As Alexander Dumas is famously reported to have said, Africa begins at the Pyrenees. And there certainly is truth in this notion. One of the Afro-Muslim dynasties ruling medieval Iberia, the Almohads, built a tower, the Kutubiyya, in their African capital, Marrakesh, in 1158, and a sister tower, the Giralda, in their Iberian capital, Sevilla, in 1172. For centuries, the Giralda was the tallest tower in Europe. Flamenco and the Andalusian communities in which it originates thus grows out of not only the transatlantic intercultural connections and circulations driven by colonization and slavery, but also out of its 800-year lineage as part of the Afro-Islamic world, which included not only what we tend to think of as North or White Africa, somehow separate and distinct from the rest of the continent, but really all of Africa, and especially north of the Guinea coast and the Eastern Horn, as well as what is now the Middle East, from Damascus to Jerusalem to Mecca and Medina. In early modern Spain and its vast empire in the Americas, early modern Spain was governed by the certification of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood. Raza, or race, a term which comes from animal husbandry, from breeding pure white sheep, signified first and foremost the invisible stain of non-Christian lineage. Long before the Catholic kings Fernando and Isabel established the Inquisition in 1478 and expelled Jews and Muslims from the peninsula in 1492, the same year they funded Christopher Columbus's world-shattering landing on Hispaniola, European ideas about nobility as established by bloodline had begun to thicken into codes establishing access to power on the basis of religious difference. Jews were blamed for the Black Plague that swept mid-14th century Europe, killing more than a quarter of Europe's population in less than 2 decades. And this anti-Semitism was magnified by dogmatic interpretations of Adam and Eve's original sin as something that was inherited, and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ as proving that Jews killed God himself. The arrival of the plague in Barcelona led to bloody attacks on Spanish Jews in 1348 and 1391. Adopting Christianity was the only way to avoid slaughter, and by the early decades of the 15th century, as much as half the Iberian Jewish population had converted to Catholicism. Conversos, Jewish converts, now acquired a new social and legal status. They were new as opposed to old, referring to those of pure blood, Christians. Moriscos, Iberian Muslims who had converted to Christianity, were also certified as new Christians. Conversion supposedly solved Spain's Jewish problem, but new Christians posed formidable new problems, stirring paranoia about whether they had really abandoned their religious beliefs. Thus, beginning with a decree issued in Toledo in 1449, religious difference inherited in the blood, racialized religious difference, became a legal doctrine. The 1449 decree declared that the faith of Jews who had converted to Christianity was suspect, and therefore Jews should not hold public offices from which they might injure or insult pure old Christians, lindos cristianos viejos. This doctrine codified what conversion to Christianity had made invisible, the indelible stain of non-Christian lineage, raza, or race. Old Christians were lindos, or pretty, a term related to limpieza, as in limpieza de sangre. The 1449 decree racialized Judaism, making it a matter of blood that could not be expunged by conversion. In so doing, Spain linked raza to diminished social status. In Sonidos, I examine how flamenco dances out the contradictory notions of what we now think of as race. Racial or racist ideology originated in Catholic battles against Judaism and Islam as the casting of religious difference onto the surface of the skin. Christian universalism justified the barbarities of the transatlantic slave trade, but paradoxically also undermined racial categories. Enslavement and forced conversion to Christianity were advertised as a boon to their victims, and yet, as Casas says, to deny any human beings the possibility of redemption from their abject state was to deny Christ himself. To understand how foundational Spanish racial thinking is to current ideologies of race, consider that the brand used to mark slaves, often on their faces, was the word esclavo, symbolized as an S, as we see here, and a clavo, or a nail, in this manner, which looks very much like a dollar sign, doesn't it? Spain sowed our idea of race as an inexpungible stain, and yet the violent pressure to suppress religious dissent engendered a society racked by skepticism and confounded by the ironies of false identity. And anybody who has read Cervantes knows this. Sonidos Negros describes how these instabilities and internal contradictions are reflected in flamenco's ironic and equivocal performances of blackness as bulla, or confusion. The systematic erasure of any traces of Jewish and Muslim cultures continued during the reign of Isabel and Fernando's son, Carlos V, and Carlos V's son, Felipe II, proclaimed stringent new laws in 1566, which ordered censuses tracking genealogy and compiling massive and detailed information on all of his subjects. Felipe II's successor, Felipe III, completed the project, ordering the expulsion starting in 1609 of the Moriscos. But the state mandated that Moriscos leave behind all their children under the age of 5, and in most circumstances under the age of 10. Such cruelty merely amped up the pressure to assimilate, to learn to speak in Christian, that is Spanish, to abandon their traditional dress, to intermarry with old Christian families in order to blend in, or to slip back into Spain. The very implementation of these policies sowed destabilizing seeds of doubt. We see in this image of Felipe III, commissioned in commemoration of the decision to expel the Moriscos, that the king represents himself as a Christ-like good shepherd in the field tending his flock. He has seen the star and heard the voice of the angel, having understood that Christ is born, has rushed to worship him at the manger. He is shown here as the humble steward of an idealized Spain, cleansed of cultural and biological traces of Moorish and Jewish Iberia. This shepherd trope is, of course, central to Christian iconography, but it also goes to the crux of the acute instabilities that would eventually topple Spain's empire. On the one hand, social hierarchy was determined by blood purity, a system in which one drop of bastard lineage could disinherit. On the other hand, the imperialist agenda of colonization was implemented through evangelization, whose rationale depends upon the idea that Christian redemption is possible. Spain bound these contradictions together by conceptualizing invisible purities of the blood as materialized in the form of physical defects, represented in dance as a counter-hegemonic denial of upright virtue and harmony in favor of lascivious confusion and ruckus. The conceptualization of race as embodied leads directly to the doubled performances of the Pastor Bobo, the bumpkin shepherd. In Christmas pageants across the Spanish Empire, the Pastor Bobo comes bumbling onto the stage, ostentatiously eating pork and drinking wine as an affirmation of his purity of blood, but startled and incredulous at the appearance of the angel. Teetering between confusion and epiphany, hell and heaven, the Bobo struggles to comprehend Catholic doctrine, his antics providing both comic entertainment and teaching the canonical message. Will he see the light of Christ or won't he? The Bobo's confusion, dance with clumsy jumps and noisy footwork, figures his unredeemed state, and his progress toward epiphany is enacted through transformations in and the elevation of his deviant speech from pidgin to Latin, and from ostentatiously muddled body language to virtuosic composure. Notions of racial difference thus constructed the rituals of Christmas. The Pastor Bobo's unbridled jumps and noisy footwork were codes for being of dubious and therefore suspect lineage. The Bobo's clowning enacted the central story of evangelization. Epiphany, the acceptance of Christianity, leads to redemption and the supposed proffer of citizenship. But the transformation that Epiphany wrought in this character's body language actually dramatized the caste distinctions that stratified Spanish society and the circular logic of associating whiteness with moral virtue. The Bobo's stomps and jumps were distilled in aristocratic Spanish dance academies into virtuosic jumps as marks of distinction, refinement, and training, depictions of the Bobo who has shaken off his confusion, ratified blood purity, citizenship, and social status. in 17th century aristocratic dance academies, jumps such as the boleo, which is pictured here, were practiced. So you see here, this is a dance manual from 1602. It's actually from Milan, but it's from Spanish Milan. And what we see is a dancer practicing to kick a tassel. You see that tassel hanging there. What he's going to do is he's going to kick that tassel. He's going to jump. He's going to kick the tassel with his left leg, right? And he's going to jump off his right leg, and he's going to scissor his legs in the air. Eventually, he's going to do a 360-degree revolution with his body, like an incredible gymnast, and the tassel is going to be 2 hand widths above his head. So it's a very, very hard jump to perform. Spain found these contradictions. Oh, sorry. This virtuosic jump is the danced equivalent of this painting of Felipe III, asserting that aristocrats were humble shepherds who had been redeemed and thus were epitomes of Christian virtue. These virtuosic jumps, I argue, feed into the character dancers of the 18th century ballet, and the narrative of the Pastor Bobo's redemption, I argue, echoes not only in the aspirational harlequins of the early colonial United States and of the Enlightenment, but also in the most infamous number of U.S. blackface minstrelsy, Jump Jim Crow. Nevertheless, the Bobo's representation of confusion often opened a space for enacting the most profound imperative of resistance to slavery and cultural genocide. So you see here in a performance in Cuba in 1855 that we have abacoa masks and instruments that are hiding in plain sight. This is a Christmas celebration. These guys are supposed to be the 3 kings, right? But we see that these are African dance ideas and musical ideas that are preserved within, kind of cloaked within these Christian ceremonies and festivities. Cloaked in comic confusion, performances of the Bobo preserved the cultures and religions of home in mighty syncretism, defying and denying abjection and asserting the ancestral lineages of those enslaved. Jumping in dance, thus, I argue, leaves this gravely consequential racial and racist distinction between Jump Jim Crow and the virtuosity of courtly ballet hanging in the air. And in flamenco, jumping turns out to have a fascinating and only recently discovered racialized aspect. In 2015, when I met my dear friend and colleague Kiko Morda for the first time, I showed him a film made by Lumiere at the Paris World's Fair, which I knew to be important because it was the first recording of flamenco dance, a cuadro, a performing ensemble consisting of singer, guitar, palmas or hand-clapping percussion, and dancers. Kiko and I had both worked on early films of Spanish dance, and so we decided to write an article together on this 1900 film. I was to do the dance analysis, and Kiko was to set out identifying the artists. I'll just mention that Kiko has translated Sonidos into Spanish. It was just published this year by Libargo. Previous studies of this film had identified the male dancer as Maestro José Otero Aranda. But as we began the process, Kiko insisted it could not be Otero dancing because the dancer was a Black man. In all my years of dancing in Spain, I had literally never seen a Black flamenco dancer. I resisted. It must be the angle of the sun on his face, or who knows what. I couldn't see it. When he finally convinced me with evidence, with documentary evidence, that José Otero was not in Paris in 1900 at the time that this film was shot, but that Jacinto Padilla, El Negro Medi, was, I really started to ask myself the bigger question and the deeper question of why I couldn't see it in the first place. El Negro Medi was born in Algeciras, and my guess would be around 1850. And therefore, even though he was Black and we think of Cuban descent, and of course, Cuba did not abolish slavery until 1886, Being born in Spain, he would have been born a free man. He was a bullfighter, a producer, a well-known flamenco singer and dancer, and also an equestrian acrobat, we think from a circus family. In the 1840s, a grotesque clown, and I think the term grotesque here is used in the balletic category of a grotesco or a comique dancer, which is to say an athletic jumping clown. With the same nickname, Meri or Medic, performed the extraordinary and dangerous double somersault, performing 2 complete revolutions in the air without a net at the Madrid circus. My hypothesis, based on the flamenco custom of passing nicknames along with artistic lineages within families, is that this Señor Medic was Padilla's father. In this 1875 advertisement, we see the celebrated mulatto Medic will dance, play the guitar, and sing flamenco, serious or cantejondo forms, and also a tango, which is an Afro-Cuban form known in the 19th century in Spain as a tango de negros, or a black tango. As a circus acrobat, Meri was known for his dangerous salto de la batalla, in which he somersaulted over various circus lads holding up rifles with bayonets in the air. And he was also known in the bull ring to sit in a chair in the middle of the ring and wait for the bull to be almost upon him before jumping up to stab the bull with his banderillas or lances. Is this the jump that Meri employs springing out of his chair in the Lumiere film? So this is Anita Reguera, Anita de la Feria, and you can see that Meri is sitting behind her. He's singing, and he's marking the rhythm with a cane on his chair. And he jumps up and he lands right on the beat. The rhythm that these guys are performing is called precarious. Everything they do is very recognizable to us today, except that Meri performs these really, really acrobatic and unusual jumps, some things that are struck me as very unusual in flamenco today. So I'm just putting this in slow motion so you can see he performs the first jump here and lands right in front of her to dance. He lands right on the beat. And then he performs, very traditional steps that we know today. And he's preparing to do a second jump, which is just a jump to the side. She's doing very traditional steps as well. So he's now going to jump to the side. And then he's going to use that as a preparation for this third jump where he jumps in the air, swivels his hips, turns his body 180 degrees and sticks the landing. Flamenco came into being as a performance genre in the mid-19th century, spurred by the intense desire of Spain's cultural and political elite to defend their status as European, precisely by asserting Spain's unique national identity as personified by the Spanish Roma, Spain's last remaining other. And yet, in addition to its aspirations toward elite culture, the 19th century stagings of national identity that in Spain tended toward flamenco also absorbed the popular tropes of the equestrian circus, the tightrope daredevil, the Gitano exotic, and U.S. blackface minstrelsy. Spaniards easily apprehended Jim Crow and his ilk in terms of the Pastor Bobo narrative. In fact, the Bobo's narrative of transformation, and we might even say emancipation, weaves through the moving story of Jacinto Padilla, El Negro Meri, a black man long forgotten and erased from flamenco history. In fact, I think that this unremembered flamenco artist has not only left his stamp on flamenco singing with the tangos that he was known for, but on flamenco dance as well. Witness the signature jumps of Antonio Montoya Flores, El Farruco, one of the greatest male flamenco dancers of the 20th century, and whose children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren have developed his style to ever more athletic. And I'm going to just turn the sound off and show you this in slow motion so you can see. Let's see. So here he's doing the preparation, and he's going to do the jump, the third jump that Mary does. He's going to jump into the air, swivel his hips, and stick the landing. He doesn't turn his body, but everything else is the same. Flamenco came into being as a performance genre in the mid-19th century. Oh, excuse me. Once Kiko had discovered that the dancer in the 1900 Lumiere film was Jacinto Padilla Negro Meri, it raised the question of why and how. How could a Black flamenco artist be so celebrated in the last quarter of the 19th century, considered to be flamenco's golden age, that he was hired to perform in the Spanish pavilion in the 1900 Paris World's Fair? And then why had we never heard of him until Kiko Mora's 2016 discovery? In 1900, Spain had lost the last of its American empire just 2 years earlier, while France, ever Spain's rival, still had substantial colonial possessions in Africa. Toni Morrison theorizes how the white U.S. navigated its terror of human freedom, the thing they coveted most of all, by casting enslaved Black people as surrogate selves. In flamenco Spain, this surrogate identity is figured by the Gitanos, the Spanish Roma. Consider the multiple lines of gaze traced in Velázquez's iconic 1626 Las Meninas, or the dilemmas of identity, who is original and who is a double, figured so acutely in Miguel de Unamuno's play El Otro of 1926. Flamenco represents Spain's troubled attempts to reclaim its lost stature among European nations, its whiteness, by embodying its Blackness, thus scrambling the very notion of race which founded Spain's empire. This instability, introduced by the Christian notion of redemption, cracks just slightly the carapace of racial ideology, an aperture through which flow, I argue, in Sonidos, subversive and indeed transformative bodily forces. Flamenco's instantiation of modernist becoming, I argue, happens within Black subjectivity. Thank you. I'll stop the share and hopefully we have time for questions.
What a great talk. That was so informative. That was so interesting. So we will be taking
And I
questions.
can't hear you. Let's see. Maybe that's because I did this. Okay, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can. I just turned my sound off.
Great. So we'll be taking questions. You can put your questions in the chat. Let me see there. You can put your questions in the chat and then we'll get to them. I have some questions for you as well. We can start off with, this is such an intense body of research. What was the catalyst for writing this work? It's so immense and so specific.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you know, really the catalyst was that I fell in love with flamenco when I was 15 years old, and when I graduated college, I found myself by a miracle and a stroke of luck performing in flamenco clubs, tablaos, which were like jazz clubs. So I was kind of improvising. I was performing, you know, for 5 years, I was performing twice a night in these ensembles where, you know, I would dance a solo and I would also accompany the other artists with hand percussion. And I did that, you know, nightly for 5 years. And so I was in that context, and I was one of very, like maybe 2 or 3 other foreigners who were working in those clubs. Everybody else almost all the other artists were Roma. And so I was in this situation where I didn't belong. I wasn't supposed to be there. Like I'm a Jewish, you know, I'm a Jew, Eastern European Jew from the United States. And yet somehow I did belong. So I was really kind of dealing with all of these questions of identity and authenticity on a very physical level and basic level. And when I came back to the United States, I had another incredible stroke of luck, which was that I landed at Temple University doing my graduate work, my doctorate in dance history under the tutelage of Brenda Dixon Gottschalk, who is just an eminence in the dance studies world. For studying, her book of 1996 is Digging the Africanist Presences in U.S. Concert Dance. So she was looking at like Balanchine and looking at, what made Balanchine, Balanchine who came from, the Ballet Russe, what made his style uniquely American? Well, it was the addition of jazz, right? And jazz is, of course, a Black American form. And so she was looking at, kind of peeling, looking under the covers, to try to peel off these layers of invisibilization like we see with Mary, right? And to try to look beneath that. And the other thing that she taught me was to do my research with my body. So from my body, that was where I came to this research.
Oh, wow. That's really great. It's a two-part question. What was your favorite part of the whole process of making this book? And then what was the most difficult part of it?
Well, the most difficult part as one of my daughters said to me, Ma, of 60,000 people that sit down to write a book, how many people do you think actually finish the damn book, right? So,
Mm.
definitely sitting in my chair, literally like, pulling my hair out and trying to figure out, kind of um, just these kind of perceptions that I had, right? These kind of like different thoughts and trying to put them together in a cogent and coherent whole was very, very difficult and took a long time. So I was working on the book. I started in like 2010 maybe, and the book was published in 2019. So that'll tell
Oh,
you how
wow.
long it takes. I have to say the most incredible part. First of all, it's published by Oxford University Press, which is amazing. That's an amazing press. And then in 2020, I got this prize from the American Society for Theater Research. Like Joseph Roach has gotten that prize, like Elizabeth. The people that had gotten that prize in previous years were just giants to me. And what they said to me when they gave me the prize is they thought it was a field-changing work. And I do think that it has helped us move the needle. I was recently in Spain doing a presentational tour of the translation of Sonidos into Spanish, and um, I talked to a really wonderful scholar named Cristina Cruces Rodan, who's a friend of mine and just like also just a giant flamenco scholar. And she said, we now, it used to be that we would teach flamenco history. We would say, flamenco is like the Christians, the Moors, and the Jews, right? And now we say it's the five peoples. We say it's the Christians, the Moors, the Jews, the Roma, and the Africans. So now it's like things are really shifting and people are starting to understand, more about ourselves and about our tradition.
Hmm. That's great. Well, so how did you say you did research through the body? So what does that mean? And what other types of research, what was that process like in creating this monograph?
Oh, thank you so much that's a great question. So, okay, I'll tell you a story, which was one of the original stories. There's a book called Semillas de Ébano, or Ebony Seeds, and it's written by José Luis Navarro Garcia. And it's about, I think it's called, it's like the Ebony Seeds of Flamenco or something like that. Like it's the first book that I know of that is really exploring kind of the African roots of flamenco. And I'm reading the book, and it's like this really amazing book. And like all Spaniards, European research is very encyclopedic. And so he has all of these sources from the 18th century, which are talking about a dance, which you guys have probably even heard of, called the fandango. The fandango is this kind of big, broad cultural phenomenon of the 18th century that we find in classical music, and we find in a bunch of Latin American musics, and we also find in flamenco. And And in the 18th century, a fandango was basically a dance party. And so he's describing these, European sources that are going to a fandango or a dance party. And like Casanova is one of those tourists, and he goes to a fandango, and he says, if you dance the fandango with a woman, you can do anything you want with her later. Casanova, that was his MO, right? And I was so frustrated because all that he was talking about, Jose Luis Navarro Garcia, everything, all of these, the only thing these 18th century sources said was that it was lascivious. That's all they said, right? And it was so frustrating to me. And then he was describing, there was one of the sources that was describing where a man and a woman are chasing around each other, and they're circling around each other, and he's pursuing her and she's escaping him at the last minute, and then all of a sudden, the art of the dance is to stop right at the last moment, like at the moment where they're just about to throw each other into each, have an embrace and a kiss, right in front of everybody. They stop right before that, and that's the artistry, is to be able to have a complete stop. And all of a sudden it clicked for me, because I'm a dancer, and not only that, but I've taught, flamenco dance for 155 years in the United States. I realized that this was a flamenco dance called the Sevillanas. And I realized that the step that they were talking about is a step that's called the pasada. So that was a real key to unlocking a lot of things, because it turns out that the pasada, or this kind of chase, is a motif that animates the fandango all through the Americas in the 18th century, and is related to a movement idea called the bacunao in Cuba, where bacunao means a shot, like a bacuna is a shot. So it's an injection of a sharp object inside something else. So you can see what the inference is there. And that is a movement idea which to the white audience it sells really well, and it really is attractive to the white audience, and so it kind of leads to the popularity of this fandango form, for example. But at the same time, on the inside, it's a preservation of religious dance traditions that are African and that are retained in the diaspora. So it's like this amazing kind of unlocking of a religious motif that is hiding in plain sight. And the only reason I got to that, and that's one of the most important discoveries in my book, and the only reason I got to that was because I'm a flamenco dancer, because nobody else reading those movement descriptions would understand, would make that connection. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. We do have a question. Let's see. How much of traditional Jewish dance appears in flamenco dance?
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, I am writing right now a second monograph, which deals with medieval Iberia. So Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, and did Jews stay in Spain? Absolutely. I mean, people stayed in hiding, they blended in, and they're there. And Jewish culture, like Islamic culture, is very much in the substrate of what flamenco is. But like if you think about Jewish dance now, today, like the hora or something like that you dance at a Jewish wedding or something like that, those are actually dances that are sort of reconstructed in the 19th century, in the wake of the Zionist movement. And, and by the time Israel is founded, like they're taking traditions from around them, just like the language. Hebrew is, kind of adapts, language from, the neighboring, from Arabic, and also, from English and whatever. So, it's hard to say how much of the movement tradition, I don't have a way of really tying the movement tradition to, Jewish dance. But what I will say is this, that we don't know very much, hardly anything about the dance of medieval Iberia, and we don't hardly know anything about the music of medieval Iberia until about the 13th century. But what we do know is that we do know about the poetry, the lyric poetry. And I'm working right now on tying a very basic flamenco gesture into the strophic structure of this poetry. So I am trying to build a link. It's hard. I've been knocked down already a few times by people who say, no, no, that's impossible. But, I'm going to just keep trying because what the hell?
Oh, wow. Okay, well, we'll have one more question. Let's see, you said that you fell in love with flamenco when you were 15 years old. What's so special about flamenco to you? And was
Mm.
that the first type of dance that you learned?
Well, it's sort of. So when I was a kid in synagogue, I did Israeli folk dance, and I fell
Oh,
in love
wow.
with that. But then when I was in high school, I was kind of a refugee from PE. I took a class, a dance class to avoid taking PE. And I saw flamenco when I was in high school, and it was like in Spanish they say a flechazo. I fell in love with it. I literally started to cry and said, that's what I want to do with for the rest of my life.
Oh,
And, at that time, I think the thing that I was so struck by in flamenco was um, the power of its expression. There's just this. I mean, you saw in Paquera that I showed you at the beginning, that first one. I mean, it's like a, she's like a thunderclap. I don't know. She's
yeah.
just so powerful, right? And but the other thing that I really, really love about flamenco is um, is the rhythmic practice. Flamenco is a rhythmic practice. So, when you do flamenco, you have that kind of circle. You saw that most in the Farruko film that I showed at the end, that last, where you saw like 25 or 30 people behind him, and they're all clapping their hands, and they're all, somebody's singing, and the guitars are all playing, and everybody says ole at the same time. And it's like this kind of like rushing river that you get to kind of jump into, and it's just the best. That's what I love the most about flamenco. Really do.
Oh, great. That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and to talk about Sonidos Negros with us, and appreciate your time. And hopefully we'll get to see what your new work is in the future
Yes,
really
exactly.
soon.
Thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Paul.